The boardroom went silent. Not the polite quiet of people thinking. The held-breath quiet of people recalibrating. Daniel Mercer sat at the head of the table, jacket pressed, smile already forming. He looked at me standing near the door with my notepad and said it easily, the way someone says something they have never once had challenged. "Ren, just take notes. This conversation is above your pay grade." Soft laughter moved around the table. I felt it land the way I had felt it land every single time before. But this time I did not sit down. I closed my notepad, set it on the table, and looked directly at him. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice completely level, "I think this is exactly my place." They thought I was overstepping. They had absolutely no idea what I was about to say. Everything that brought me to that moment began 14 months earlier, the day Daniel Mercer walked through the door. My name is Ren Whitmore. I am 34 years old, and I had been with Callaway Ventures since before it had a logo or a single paying client. I was employee number 3. The CEO, Frederick Holt, had a vision and almost no infrastructure to support it. I built the infrastructure. I designed the onboarding system every new hire still used. I hired the first 6 members of the operations team. I sat in every early client meeting, every crisis call, every late-night session where the company's future was genuinely uncertain. I was not invisible then. Frederick called me his right hand and meant it. But companies grow, and growth attracts polished, credentialed people who slowly rearrange the room until the people who actually built it are standing outside it. That is exactly what happened to me. It happened so gradually that by the time I fully understood it, my title had already changed and my voice had already been removed from the rooms that mattered. Daniel Mercer arrived 14 months before the board meeting. He came through a recruitment firm, carried 3 prestigious credentials, and entered every room like he had been expected. I recognized the type immediately. The kind of person who learns a company's language quickly and uses it in ways that make everyone assume he has been there far longer than he has. Within his first week, he had met every senior leader personally. Within his first month, he had presented a strategic realignment framework to the board, using terminology I had heard Frederick use in private meetings for 2 years. Within 6 weeks of his arrival, my calendar began thinning. Meetings I had always attended were now marked executive leadership only. My name stopped appearing on certain documents. Nobody told me directly. The exclusion was simply assumed, the way gravity is assumed, present and unnamed. I watched it happen and said nothing. I was still learning exactly what I was dealing with. The first time I watched it happen clearly was in a leadership meeting I had spent 3 days preparing materials for. The agenda, the financial summary, the operational risk report, all of it came from my desk. Daniel stood at the front of the room and presented the workflow optimization system I had designed 18 months earlier as though he had built it himself. He used my framework labels, my sequencing logic, my projected efficiency numbers. I sat at the side of the table and waited for someone to correct the attribution. Frederick looked genuinely interested. The CFO asked follow-up questions. Nobody looked at me once. I understood in that moment that this was not a misunderstanding. Nobody had forgotten who built the system. They had simply decided, quietly and collectively, that it was more convenient not to remember. That realization settled into me like cold water, slow, certain, and impossible to ignore once it had arrived. HR called it a role realignment. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning explaining that my position was being restructured to better reflect the company's evolving needs. My new title was Executive Assistant to the CEO. The salary stayed the same. The workload increased. I managed Frederick's schedule, prepared all board materials, coordinated cross-departmental communications, and maintained the administrative infrastructure that kept senior leadership functioning daily. But I was no longer in strategy meetings. I was no longer listed on client-facing documents. I was the person who set up the room before important people arrived and tidied it after they left. Daniel described the change in a hallway conversation deliberately held within my hearing as putting talented people where they are most useful. He glanced at me when he said it. I smiled back. I had learned early that the most powerful response to being underestimated is to let the other person remain comfortable in that assumption for as long as possible. The public humiliation came 6 weeks after the title change. We were in a full leadership meeting, 12 people at the table, including 3 board observers attending quarterly. I had been asked to present a logistics update touching on a supply chain issue that would affect 2 major client contracts within 30 days if unaddressed. I was 4 sentences in when Daniel interrupted. He did not wait for a pause or raise his hand. He simply spoke over me, directing his words at the room as though I had not been speaking. "I think what Ren is trying to say," he said pleasantly, "is that logistics is complex and we should be careful not to confuse support functions with strategic decision-making." 2 people nodded. I finished my sentence, made my point, and sat down. That night I did not sleep. I lay in the dark thinking about the difference between what had been taken from me and what could not be taken. And I thought about something I had not revisited in a very long time. Years earlier, when Callaway was still small enough to share one printer, Frederick had come to me privately. The company could not meet its full payroll during a difficult second quarter. He offered me a choice: defer part of my salary in exchange for equity. He was honest about the risk. He said the shares could be worth nothing. He showed me the actual numbers without dressing them up. I took a week to think carefully. Then I accepted. Not because I was certain the company would succeed, but because I had helped build it and I understood that ownership meant something different from salary. I accepted a small percentage and never sold it. Not during good quarters, not during hard ones. While other early employees took profits and moved on, I held my position quietly. And in the months after Daniel arrived and the meetings stopped and my title changed, I had started paying very close attention to the shareholder register. What I found there changed everything. The first purchase happened quietly. One of Callaway's original angel investors, a man named Harold Birch, who had backed Frederick in the earliest days and whose patience with slow returns had visibly worn thin, reached out through a broker looking to exit his position. I heard about it through a contact in the legal team, mentioned in passing as a routine share transfer. I called Harold directly. We had met twice at early company events. He remembered me. I told him I was interested in acquiring his shares privately, that I had the capital ready, and that I could move quickly. He asked why I wanted them. I told him I had been with the company since the beginning and believed in its long-term value. He paused and then said that was more than most people had told him lately. We agreed on a price within 2 days. The paperwork was filed correctly through proper legal channels and registered without announcement. Nobody noticed. That was exactly how I needed it. I became, in the weeks that followed, the most cooperative version of the role they had assigned me. I booked meetings without complaint. I prepared board materials with careful attention to detail. I sent clean, well-organized follow-up notes after every senior session. I remembered coffee orders. I smiled in corridors. Daniel began relying on me heavily for the invisible infrastructure that made his days function: scheduling, document preparation, the organizational machinery people only notice when it breaks. He did not thank me for it, but he depended on it deeply. And while I maintained the smooth surface of the role they had placed me in, I was doing something else entirely underneath it. I was listening to every conversation I was trusted to overhear. I was tracking every decision Daniel made that conflicted with what the operations data actually showed. I was documenting every time he dismissed a risk that the ground-level team had flagged in writing. I kept a private file and added to it every single week. Daniel's expansion strategy began showing serious cracks at the 9-month mark. He had pushed aggressively for Callaway to enter 3 new market segments simultaneously, a move that had impressed the board in the presentation room but was quietly straining operations in ways that were becoming harder to conceal. Delivery timelines on 2 new client contracts were slipping behind schedule. Cost overruns on the technology build-out for the 3rd segment were running 40% above projection. I knew these exact numbers because I prepared the internal reporting that fed the executive summaries, which meant I saw the raw figures before Daniel's team had the chance to reframe them in their most optimistic version. I documented the actual numbers alongside Daniel's presented versions, every entry timestamped and saved. I was not building a personal case against him out of anger. I was doing what I had always done, paying close attention, because the truth always surfaces eventually, and I intended to be ready when it did. Frederick had been relying on me privately for months, in the way powerful people rely on capable people when they prefer not to admit it publicly. He stopped by my desk late in the day, after the floor had thinned, and asked my opinion on things, a supplier negotiation stalling, a personnel situation escalating quietly, a client relationship that needed careful handling. I gave him honest assessments every time, clearly and without embellishment. He listened and usually acted on what I said, presenting the decision later as his own judgment. I never pointed that out, but I registered it carefully because it told me something important. Frederick trusted my understanding of this company more than he trusted almost anyone else's. He simply did not trust it enough to say so publicly. That gap between his private reliance on me and his public deference to Daniel was the most important thing I understood about my situation. Frederick was not blind to what was happening. He was caught between two versions of the future and had not yet chosen. The second share acquisition came 4 months after the first. A former product lead named Cassandra Webb, who had left the company after a performance review that she and I both understood had been engineered by Daniel's team, contacted me through a mutual professional connection. She had shares she wanted to sell and had been quietly looking for the right buyer. She knew about my first purchase through the small professional network that carries such information. We met for coffee and she was direct. She wanted out, she wanted fair value, and she wanted the shares to go to someone who remembered what the company had been before Daniel arrived. I bought them at a fair valuation, processed through the same proper legal channels as before. My stake had now grown to a level that was meaningful but still below the threshold requiring automatic public disclosure. I remained invisible in the shareholder register, exactly where I needed to stay while the third and final acquisition was still approaching. The board member was named Iris Okafor. She had been on Callaway's board for 6 years, had backed Frederick through 2 difficult refinancing rounds, and had the quality of experienced long-term investors. She watched quietly for extended periods and then asked one precise question that exposed exactly what nobody had wanted to discuss. She had been watching me for weeks. I knew this because she positioned herself near me during breaks in board prep sessions and twice made deliberate eye contact in moments when Daniel had spoken over me or dismissed something I had said. After one meeting, she stayed behind while I collected materials from the table. She said it without preamble, "You understand this company better than the people running it." I said I had been there a long time. She nodded as though I had confirmed something rather than deflected it. She asked nothing else that day. But I understood clearly that I had found an ally, and that allies positioned correctly matter more than anything else. The major deal Daniel had structured in the second quarter, a distribution partnership he had presented to the board as transformative, began visibly failing in month 7. The partner company had operational capacity problems that basic due diligence would have caught, and that several members of Callaway's own operations team had flagged in writing before the contract was signed. Daniel had overridden those concerns, describing the team's assessment in writing as overly cautious. I had those emails. I had the original due diligence report with his written dismissal attached. I had the subsequent internal communications as every warning sign the team had identified began materializing one by one on schedule. When the board requested an internal review, Daniel submitted a summary characterizing the failures as external factors outside the company's control. I read it carefully. Then I opened my reference file and began organizing 11 months of documentation into something that could be presented clearly, calmly, and without a single sentence that could be disputed. I drafted a resignation email twice. The first time was after Daniel publicly attributed a client retention strategy one had quietly advised Frederick on verbally, in one of our late-day conversations, to his own analysis. I typed the email, read it twice, and closed it without sending. The second time was after a longer and harder day when the weight of the role felt heavier than the purpose beneath it. I got further that time. My finger was hovering. Then I opened the shareholder registry update that had arrived that morning and reviewed my current position carefully. I thought about what leaving now would actually mean, not just professionally, but structurally. The shares did not leave with me. The documentation did not matter if I was no longer present when the board meeting happened. I deleted the email. I made tea. I went back to work. Because I had not come this far by abandoning a position before it was ready to be used. The third acquisition was still coming. The third acquisition was the one that changed everything. One of Callaway's original co-founders, a man named George Ashby, who had stepped back from the company years earlier after burning out, had been holding a significant share position without any operational involvement. He had declined every previous approach from multiple parties, citing a vague sentimental attachment. I contacted him not through a broker but directly, which I believe was what made the difference. We spoke for 90 minutes. I told him what the company had been when we were both at the beginning of it. I told him what I believed it could still be. I told him honestly that I was building something and I wanted his shares to be part of it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he had been waiting for someone who actually remembered what the company had been built for. The deal closed in 3 weeks. When the paperwork was finalized, I sat at my kitchen table in complete silence. I had crossed the threshold. I was now the majority shareholder. Daniel scheduled his board presentation for the 4th Thursday of the following month. I added it to the calendar myself. He had titled it Strategic Vision, Phase 2 Growth Plan. His briefing notes described it as a framework for securing additional investor capital and expanding executive authority. Reading carefully, that last phrase meant he was seeking to formally concentrate decision-making power in his own position. I had seen early drafts of the financial projections because he had asked me to format the presentation slides. The growth assumptions were built entirely on the distribution partnership that had already been failing for 2 quarters, extrapolating forward from numbers that were no longer accurate. I had the current actual figures. I had the original warnings his team had dismissed. I had 11 months of documentation organized and ready. He had built his strongest argument on the most fragile foundation available to him, and he had asked me personally to format the slides. I formatted them carefully and said nothing. For weeks before the board meeting, I met with Iris Okafor privately, a coffee shop away from the office. No documents brought, just a direct conversation. I spoke for 20 minutes. I described what I had observed, what I had documented, and what I intended to present at the board meeting. Then I told her my shareholding position. I watched her face carefully as I described the total stake. She was not a person whose expressions moved easily, but something shifted, a quiet recalibration behind the eyes, the look of someone fitting a significant piece of information into a framework they had already been building. She asked 2 questions only. Was the documentation legally obtained? And was I prepared to present it factually without making it personal? I answered yes to both. She nodded once and said she would be paying attention. We finished our coffee and left separately. I drove home and spent the next 3 weeks preparing the most important presentation of my life. 3 days before the board meeting, Daniel stopped near my desk in the late afternoon, the relaxed end-of-day version of him that appeared when he felt things were going well. He said I had done well that year. He said not everyone could handle real responsibility the way I had. He delivered it with the generous tone of a man giving a compliment from a position he believed was permanent and unassailable. I looked at him and said thank you. I meant it in a way he would never have understood, because his complete certainty about where things stood had made my final weeks of preparation significantly easier. He had no suspicion. He had not monitored the shareholder register because he had long ago decided I was not a threat. He had decided I was the person who set out the water glasses. He had put me exactly where he thought I was least dangerous. And I had spent 14 months making sure that position was precisely where I needed to be. The board meeting began at 9 in the morning. I arrived at 7:30 as always, prepared the room, connected the technology, placed materials at each seat, and set up Daniel's presentation on the display screen. I put my own folder at the position I had always occupied at board meetings, against the wall, slightly removed from the table, where assistants sit. Board members arrived gradually. Iris came in third and glanced at me once without expression. Frederick arrived last, carrying the specific fatigue of a man who knows something is wrong and has not yet decided what to do about it. Daniel arrived with his usual energy, looked around the room, gave me a brief approving nod for the setup, and sat down. I did not move to my position against the wall. I stayed standing near the table. Daniel noticed. He looked at me, and then he said it. The same words, the same easy confidence, the same soft laughter moving around the room. I let it settle. Then I closed my notepad, set it on the table, and looked directly at him. I said it clearly enough for every person in the room to hear without effort. Actually, I think this is exactly my place. Daniel smiled the way people smile when they are deciding how to handle a subordinate who has momentarily forgotten their position. He started to respond. I spoke first. I said that before the presentation began, I needed to make the board aware of a material update to the company's shareholder structure. I said this not as a request but as a statement, the tone of someone who understands their standing and is exercising it. I placed my folder on the table and opened it to the first document, a legal summary of current share ownership, prepared by my solicitor, listing every transaction and the updated ownership percentages clearly. I slid copies to Iris, to Board Chair Edmund Walsh, and to the independent non-executive director at the end of the table. Daniel's smile had not disappeared yet, but it had changed, tighter at the edges, uncertain of where to go next. Edmund Walsh read the ownership summary twice. He looked at me over his reading glasses, then back at the document. He said in a measured voice, "Ren, these figures show you hold a majority position." I confirmed that was correct. I explained I had acquired shares through 3 separate transactions, all conducted legally, all filed correctly with the company's legal team, all registered in the shareholder register the board had access to at any time. No announcement had been required, so none had been made. The documentation was complete and available. Iris Okafor gave one quiet nod from her seat, not of surprise, but of confirmation. She had known for 4 weeks and had said nothing, done nothing except show up and pay attention. Daniel was looking at the documents in front of him with the expression of a man recalculating very quickly and not liking the result. The smile was gone completely now. The room was waiting for what came next. I did not raise my voice once. I had decided weeks earlier that I would not because I was not angry, but because the facts were strong enough that emotion would only dilute them. I walked the board through Daniel's Phase 2 presentation alongside my compiled documentation, the original due diligence warnings about the distribution partnership, dismissed in his own writing. The actual performance figures from the past 2 quarters compared directly to the projections he had used to build his growth model, the time-stamped internal communications showing that operational team concerns had been raised, recorded, and overridden each time. I presented it the way I presented everything. Organized, clear, no unnecessary language. When Daniel interrupted the first time, Edmund Walsh asked him to let me finish. When he interrupted the second time, Iris said simply, without looking at him, "Daniel, please." He sat back. His authority in that room had rested entirely on the assumption that he was the most important person in it. That assumption had just been removed. The board moved with a speed that told me they had been waiting for a reason. Edmund Walsh called for a formal review of Daniel's executive position based on the documentation presented, specifically citing the pattern of overriding documented risk assessments and the resulting financial damage to 2 major client contracts. Iris seconded immediately. The vote was 4-1. Daniel's termination was confirmed with cause, effective immediately. He sat completely still while Edmund read the resolution aloud. Then he looked across the table at me. Not with the polished confidence I had watched him carry for 14 months, something stripped of that, something raw underneath it. He asked in a quieter voice than I had ever heard from him whether I had known the whole time, whether everything had been leading to this moment from the very beginning. The room was silent. Everyone was waiting. I looked back at him steadily across the table, at the man who had told me I was above my pay grade and put me exactly where he thought I could do no damage. "I was exactly where you put me," I said. He stared for a moment longer. Then Edmund Walsh asked him to collect his belongings from the executive floor accompanied by HR. Daniel stood, buttoned his jacket from pure habit, that automatic, polished gesture, and walked out without looking back. The door closed. Edmund turned to me and asked if I was prepared to discuss a leadership transition plan. I said I was. Iris looked at me with the expression of someone who has watched a long game conclude correctly. Frederick sat with his hands flat on the table, not devastated, but altered, the way people look when the story they have been telling themselves has been permanently replaced by a truer one. After the meeting, he stopped me in the corridor and said simply, "You were always the right hand." I told him I appreciated it, because I had not done any of this to take something from someone else. I had done it to take back what had been mine from the very beginning.